In 1895, in the rugged heart of the Ozark Mountains, the name Thaddius Hawthorne became the center of a shocking affair that would whisper its way through a century of local lore. The official story, etched into the county ledger and printed in the Springfield Herald, was one of tragedy. A respected merchant, overwhelmed by some private despair, takes his own life. It was a neat, simple narrative designed to calm a nervous public and preserve the dignity of a prominent family. But the truth, buried beneath layers of civic silence and sealed behind a fortress-like stone wall, was a far more complex and disturbing tapestry of obsession, control, and a grim family pact. The real story begins not with the gunshot that echoed through the Hawthorne mansion on that crisp April morning, but in the years of suffocating quiet that preceded it. What was discovered within the walls of that grand Victorian home on Commercial Street would reveal a darkness that Springfield's elite would conspire to forget. A story pieced together from forgotten records, sealed testimonies, and the desperate, hidden words of those who lived it. This is the story of what truly happened when a man's vision for his family legacy twisted into a private kingdom of terror, and the terrible price paid for its ultimate collapse. To understand the power Thaddius Hawthorne wielded, one must first understand the world he entered. Springfield, Missouri, in 1867, was a community fractured by the Civil War. A border state city, its loyalties had been violently divided. Neighbors who had fought on opposite sides of the conflict now shared the same dusty streets, their grief and resentment simmering just below a fragile surface of civility. Into this volatile environment walked Thaddius Hawthorne, a man in his mid-30s, arriving from Pennsylvania with a quiet confidence and, more importantly, unexplained capital. At a time when the local economy was in ruins and strangers were viewed with deep suspicion, Hawthorne didn't just survive. He flourished with an almost unnatural speed. County records show he purchased a prime commercial lot within months of his arrival. By 1870, his modest dry goods store had metastasized into the Hawthorne Mercantile, a sprawling establishment offering everything from hardware to private banking services. The Springfield Republican in 1871 lauded him as a gentleman of industry and vision. Yet even in praise, there was a note of detachment. An 1873 article referred to him as one of our leading citizens, though somewhat reserved in social matters. This reservation was a shield. While other businessmen built their empires on handshakes and social connections, Hawthorne built his on calculated distance and an uncanny ability to identify and leverage the desperation of others. In 1872, Hawthorne cemented his position in Springfield society by taking a wife. Elizabeth Caldwell was, by all accounts, an ideal match for a man of his ambition. From a respectable but financially unremarkable farming family in nearby Joplin, she was 13 years his junior, pious, and known for her gentle demeanor. For a man obsessed with appearances, she was the perfect ornament. The Caldwells, like so many families in the region, had been torn apart by the war, losing one son to the Union and another to the Confederacy. Elizabeth's world had been one of church socials and domestic duties, a sheltered existence that left her wholly unprepared for the complex, guarded man she married. Their wedding, reported by the Springfield Monitor as a modest affair, was followed by their immediate removal to Springfield, where they lived above the store while their grand new home was being constructed. To the outside world, they were the picture of Victorian propriety. But behind closed doors, a different dynamic was taking shape. Elizabeth, raised to be deferential, found herself married to a man who didn't just expect obedience, but seemed to require the complete orchestration of her life, a quiet control that would, over the years, tighten into an unbreakable grip. In the late 19th century, a woman's primary duty was to produce heirs. For the wife of a man like Thaddius Hawthorne, a man consumed with the idea of legacy, this duty was paramount. But the years passed, and the Hawthorne nursery remained empty. The societal pressure was immense, and the failure was laid squarely at Elizabeth's feet. The Springfield Herald Society pages from January 1878 made a thinly veiled reference to Mrs. Hawthorne's continued disappointment in domestic matters. This public speculation was a mere echo of the private pressure she faced. Preserved in the Greene County Medical Historical Collection, the ledger of Dr. James Morrison records multiple visits to the Hawthorne residence for female complaints. The prescribed treatments, valerian root bed rest, wild yam preparations, were standard, ineffective remedies for a host of issues lumped under the dismissive diagnose is of hysteria. What the ledger doesn't record, but what Elizabeth's later writings reveal, was Thaddeus's presence during these examinations. He would stand, silent and intense, observing the doctor's work not with the concern of a loving husband, but with the cold, analytical gaze of an investor inspecting a faulty asset. The silence in the house grew heavier with each passing year, a constant, unspoken accusation that Elizabeth was failing in her most fundamental purpose. By 1880, Thaddius Hawthorne's ambition was rendered in wood and stone. On a 5-acre plot at the edge of town, shrouded by a thick stand of elm trees, he built one of the finest homes in the region, a 3-story Victorian monolith, complete with an octagonal turret and ornate wraparound porch. Architectural records show he spared no expense, importing materials from Chicago and New Orleans, a decadent display in a town that prided itself on the use of local timber and limestone. The house was a statement of power, a symbol of his success, but it was the addition he commissioned in 1882 that truly set the town to whispering. Hawthorne ordered the construction of a stone wall, 8 feet high, with a foundation sunk 3 feet into the Ozark soil, completely enclosing the entire property. In an era when prominent families displayed their homes with open lawns as a testament to their status, building such a barrier was deeply unconventional. It felt less like a feature of a country estate and more like the perimeter of a prison. Silas Putnam, the contractor who oversaw the work, recalled the specification decades later. He said he wanted privacy, Putnam noted in a 1953 interview, but it seemed to me like he was building a fort. He watched us every day, making sure every stone was set just so. It wasn't about keeping stray animals out. It was about keeping something or someone in. The wall was a physical manifestation of the isolation that now defined the Hawthorne household. The rules of engagement with the outside world became increasingly bizarre and rigid. Delivery men, the few outsiders permitted to approach the property, circulated stories of the merchant's strange protocols. Jacob Thornton, a driver for a competing dry goods store, shared his experience in a 1952 oral history recording. Old man Hawthorne had these rules, Thornton recalled. You couldn't come up the drive unless the blue flag was on the gate post. You had to ring the bell exactly 3 times, no more, no less. And you couldn't look at Mrs. Hawthorne direct if she happened to be in the receiving room. Most peculiar thing, made all the delivery boys nervous. The staff within the walls found the environment even more oppressive. Records from the Simmons Domestic Agency reveal an astonishingly high turnover rate. Between 1880 and 1890, the Hawthornes hired 19 different housekeepers. None lasted longer than 7 months. An internal note in the agency's files, discovered in the 1960s, described the position as peculiar for such a prestigious household, hinting that the generous salary could not compensate for the stifling atmosphere. Hawthorne was methodically severing every uncontrolled link between his family and the outside world, creating a hermetically sealed kingdom where he was the only law. Then, in the spring of 1883, the insulated world of the Hawthorne family unexpectedly expanded. Thaddeus announced to his business associates that he had taken in 2 young adults, Maxwell and Josephine, the orphaned children of a cousin from Philadelphia. They appeared to be in their late teens or early 20s, somber and withdrawn. The story was plausible enough, yet it crumbled under the slightest scrutiny. Decades later, researchers attempting to piece together the Hawthorne mystery could find no adoption records. Inquiries sent to Philadelphia authorities in 1953 turned up no death certificates for parents matching the description Hawthorne had provided. A rare photograph from 1884, preserved in the Springfield Historical Society archives, offers the only visual record of this new family unit. The four Hawthornes are posed formally on their porch. Thaddeus stands stiffly, a patriarch in a dark suit. Elizabeth sits beside him, looking pale and fragile, almost a stranger in the group. Behind them stand Maxwell and Josephine. The unsettling detail, immediately apparent to anyone who views the image, is the striking facial similarity between Thaddeus and the two newcomers. The same heavy brow, the same square jaw, the same deep-set, intense eyes. They were not distant cousins. The photograph screamed a truth that Thaddeus had chosen to obscure, a truth that would become central to the horrors that followed. The arrival of Maxwell and Josephine marked the beginning of the family's final, complete retreat from the world. The musical evenings Elizabeth once hosted ceased. She withdrew from the Ladies' Benevolent Society, the official reason being poor health. Thaddeus, while maintaining his vast business interests, delegated day-to-day operations to his managers, choosing to conduct his affairs from the seclusion of his home office. The family's only public appearances were at Sunday church services. They would arrive together, sit in the front pew, and leave the moment the sermon concluded, bypassing the customary social hour on the church steps. Reverend Thomas Winters of the First Presbyterian Church grew concerned. In a parish journal entry dated December 1887, he wrote, "Visited the Hawthorne residence today to inquire after Mrs. H's health, as she has been absent from services. Was met at the gate by Mr. H, who assured me all was well but declined to admit me to the house. Observed curtains moving in upper windows, but saw no one. I have concerns about the household that I cannot quite articulate." The minister's unease was a reflection of a growing, unspoken consensus in town. Something was wrong at the Hawthorne house. The stone wall had become more than just a barrier. It was a seal, locking a dark secret away from the prying eyes of the world. On the morning of April 17, 1895, that seal was broken. The official report stated that a concerned business associate, unable to reach Thaddeus for 2 days, had summoned the authorities. Sheriff James Holbrook was the first to enter the house. The public was told a simple, tragic story. Thaddeus Hawthorne was found dead in his study from a self-inflicted shotgun wound. But the sheriff's private, handwritten notes, discovered in a dusty county storage facility in 1957, painted a vastly different and more complex picture. These notes, which never made it into the official record, described a scene inconsistent with suicide. Hawthorne's body was indeed in the study, but the room itself was strangely arranged. The furniture had been moved into a circle, with 4 chairs, as if for a formal meeting or a tribunal. Hawthorne's chair was toppled backward. There were clear signs of a struggle, an overturned inkwell, scattered papers. Most damningly, the shotgun lay several feet from the body, in a position that made it highly improbable for him to have pulled the trigger himself. The scene did not suggest a man succumbing to despair. It suggested a confrontation, a judgment, and a violent conclusion to a long and terrible siege. Sheriff Holbrook's notes detail more than just the physical evidence. The walls of the study, he observed, were lined with books on peculiar subjects: genealogy, eugenics, hereditary traits, and family dynasties. One volume, left open on Hawthorne's desk, contained his own scrawled notes in the margins, with phrases like purity of line and removing contaminants underlined repeatedly. This was not the library of a simple merchant. It was the intellectual arsenal of an obsessive. But the strangest discovery was yet to come. In the parlor, Holbrook found Elizabeth, Maxwell, and Josephine. They were seated together on a sofa, silent and unmoving. He wrote that they seemed neither surprised nor particularly distressed, but rather resigned, as though awaiting an expected outcome. They offered no information and no resistance. A deputy who remained behind to secure the scene, William Clark, later reported finding a partially burned document in the study's fireplace. In a personal letter that only surfaced in 1962, he described the legible fragments, which spoke of a purification ritual to be conducted in the sanctum. Clark's official report on the matter was filed, but subsequently vanished from the county records, the first of many deliberate acts of concealment. The centerpiece of the scene in the study, laid on a small table in the middle of the circle of chairs, was a legal document. It was not a will or a business contract, but something far more sinister. Drawn up in Hawthorne's own meticulous hand, it was titled a family covenant. The language was archaic, formal, almost biblical, but its content was a blueprint for absolute control. The covenant specified that no member of the household could leave the property without Hawthorne's express permission. It demanded daily, verbal attestations of loyalty from each person to the family's sacred purpose. Most chillingly, it established a system of restitution for any perceived infraction against family harmony, with punishments to be meted out by the head of the household. One terrifying passage read, "As keeper of its bloodline, I, Thaddius Hawthorne, do establish these ordinances for the preservation of our family legacy. All who dwell under this roof are bound by sacred obligation to maintain the purity of our line, to submit to correction when necessary, and to place family loyalty above all earthly concerns." This was the document Thaddius had intended for them to sign that day. It was not just a set of rules. It was a declaration of ownership over their very souls. The official investigation, if one could even call it that, was a masterclass in obfuscation. During their brief questioning, Elizabeth, Maxwell, and Josephine remained almost entirely silent. When a deputy noted visible bruising on Josephine's wrists, she attributed it to a fall in the garden. When Maxwell was pressed about his relationship with his supposed adoptive father, he stated only, he believed in his purpose with absolute conviction. We learned not to question. But before he could be asked directly if he had killed Thaddius, the interview was abruptly terminated. An attorney, Gregory Simmons, had arrived from St. Louis with astonishing speed, suggesting he had been summoned before the sheriff was even notified. Simmons produced a recently signed will leaving everything to Elizabeth and the children. He also presented documents showing that all of Hawthorne's considerable business interests had been transferred into a trust controlled by Elizabeth just 2 days prior, on April 15th. With the family refusing to speak and a convenient legal narrative in place, the authorities quickly closed ranks. The coroner, Dr. Samuel Wilson, a man who had received a substantial loan from Hawthorne years earlier to start his practice, ruled the death a suicide, blatantly ignoring the physical evidence. The case was officially closed in under 72 hours. The truth had been efficiently and deliberately buried. With the inconvenient matter of Thaddius Hawthorne's death settled, the remaining family members returned to the house behind the stone wall. For 6 months, they maintained their isolated existence, their needs met by deliveries left at the gate. Then, in October of 1895, they vanished. Property records show the house was sold to a St. Louis banker who, curiously, never occupied it. The Hawthorne Mercantile was liquidated, its assets transferred to a bank in Chicago. The Hawthorne name, once a pillar of Springfield commerce, faded from public memory, becoming just another ghost of Commercial Street. For nearly 60 years, that was the end of the story. The house passed through several hands before being carved into apartments in the 1920s. But in 1952, during renovations, a workman broke through a wall and uncovered a hidden space between the second and third floors. Inside was a dusty trunk. It contained personal papers, photographs, and 3 leather-bound journals. The property owner donated them to the Greene County Historical Society, where they sat largely unexamined for another decade. It wasn't until 1963 that a graduate student, researching forgotten Ozark merchant families, opened the first volume and finally gave a voice to the silent woman of the Hawthorne house, Elizabeth. The journals belonged to Elizabeth Hawthorne, a meticulous record spanning from her marriage in 1872 to the family's departure in October 1895. The early entries are a poignant window into the mind of a hopeful young bride. She writes of adjusting to life in Springfield, of her husband's business acumen, and most frequently, of her deep desire for children. An entry from March 15, 1873 reads, "T has presented me with a beautiful silver hand mirror for our first anniversary. When I admired it, he said, 'A Hawthorne bride should always look her best.' He speaks often of children, of carrying on the family name. I pray nightly that God will bless us with a child soon, as I see how much this means to my husband." Another entry from November of that year reveals the first cracks in the facade. Dr. Morrison visited again today. He says there is nothing apparently wrong, that these things take time. T was in the room throughout the examination, watching with such intensity that I felt more embarrassed than the procedure itself warranted. Afterward, he locked himself in his study for hours. Through her elegant script, one can feel the creeping chill of her husband's obsessive nature and the slow, painful death of her own innocent dreams. By 1877, the tone of the journals darkens considerably. Hope gives way to fear and resignation. Elizabeth describes Thaddius not as a husband but as a warden. He dictates her schedule, reads her mail, and curates her relationships. His dark moods, she writes, can last for days, during which he retreats into his study, emerging only to issue new edicts. In a harrowing entry from July 7, 1877, she writes, "T destroyed the letter from my sister today, saying her descriptions of her children were unnecessarily provocative given our situation. When I wept, he said I was being manipulated by others' happiness, and that a true wife would focus on her husband's needs rather than what she lacks. I try to be a true wife, but sometimes the silence of this house seems to press upon my very soul." A month later, his obsession with lineage takes a more sinister turn. T has begun speaking of his family history at great length. He traces his lineage to early settlers in Pennsylvania and speaks of a special destiny. When I mentioned that my grandmother W. as partly of French descent, he became very cold and said the Hawthornes had maintained their English bloodline without contamination for 200 years. I will not mention my French ancestors again. She was learning that her own history, her very identity, was a contamination to be purged. The journals contain a significant gap. The pages for late 1882 and early 1883 have been violently torn out. When the record resumes in April 1883, Elizabeth's voice is hollowed out, her handwriting tighter, more controlled. The entry is just 6 words, a sentence freighted with terror and despair. "They have arrived. God help us all." From this point on, she refers to Maxwell and Josephine not by their names, but as the cousins. Her entries document a household now operating under a crushing regime of rules. She details specific, mandated times for meals, for conversation, and for what she ominously calls contemplation hours. During these hours, Thaddius would read aloud to the assembled family from a heavy, black-bound book, a volume she never identifies but makes clear is neither the Bible nor any work of recognized literature. A few months after their arrival, Thaddius provided a partial explanation. An entry from May 30, 1883 reads, "T has explained to me privately what I had already begun to suspect from the resemblance. The cousins are in fact his own blood, born to a woman he knew before me. The mother has died, he says, and it is his duty to bring them into the proper family fold. I am to treat them as family, but remember always that I am not of their blood." The distinction between Elizabeth and the blood was a critical element of Hawthorne's domestic tyranny. While she was controlled through isolation and psychological manipulation, Maxwell and Josephine were subjected to a more direct and brutal form of discipline. The family covenant was not yet written, but its principles were already in full effect. Elizabeth documents an incident in September 1883. J attempted to visit the milliner shop in town today without permission. T discovered her absence immediately, as though he can sense when any of us steps beyond the boundaries he has set. When she returned, he took her to his study. The cousins and I sat in the parlor, silent, listening to his voice rising and falling behind the closed door. Later at dinner, J would not raise her eyes from her plate, and there was a small cut at the corner of her mouth. Elizabeth's role was to be a passive witness, her presence a tool to amplify the humiliation of the others. She was an outsider in her own home, a non-believer forced to attend the rituals of a bizarre and terrifying family cult, with her husband as its high priest. The most disturbing entries begin in 1889. By this time, the family had been sealed within the walls for 6 years, and Hawthorne's methods of control had escalated into systematic torture. Elizabeth writes of a place she calls the basement chamber, and an object she refers to as the correction chair. Her descriptions are fragmented, written with a hand that seems to tremble on the page. She mentions sounds in the night, and how she has learned to stuff her ears with cotton wool soaked in laudanum to block them out. Several entries are just a single, repeated, chilling phrase. He took her to the chamber today. I played the piano as instructed, but the music was not loud enough. Then, an entry from February 3, 1889, provides horrifying detail. T has completed what he calls the sanctum in the basement. It has thick walls that he says are for privacy during instruction, but I think they are to muffle sound. There is a chair with straps, a table with instruments I do not recognize, and a bookstand holding the black volume. He has shown it to all of us, explaining that family discipline must sometimes be formalized to be effective. M asked if I would also be subject to the chair's correction. T smiled and said, "Elizabeth is not of our blood. Her transgressions require different management." The basement was no longer a cellar, it was a dungeon. The sanctum became the heart of Hawthorne's reign of terror. It was where his abstract obsession with purity and discipline was made brutally physical. Elizabeth's journal entry from July 19, 1889, details its use on Maxwell. M was in the sanctum for hours today. When he emerged for dinner, he moved like an old man. T watched him struggling to sit upright at the table and nodded with satisfaction. "The bloodline is strengthened through trial," he announced. Our ancestors understood this principle. Later, I helped him apply witch hazel to the welts on his back. He whispered, "It isn't about correction, it's about submission." I fear he is right. Her words reveal a profound psychological shift in the household. The violence was no longer just about punishment for broken rules. It had become a ritual, a grotesque sacrament designed to break their spirits and reinforce Thaddius's absolute power. Elizabeth, by being forced to tend to their wounds, was made complicit in their suffering. She was both prisoner and nurse, a witness trapped in an endless cycle of abuse and hollow comfort, her piano music the soundtrack to their agony. As the years wore on, the psychological torment intensified, twisting the very concept of family into a sickening parody. An entry from November 1894 reads, "T now requires that M and J refer to him as father, though they are grown, and he is not truly their father in the eyes of the law or the church. The resemblance between the three of them has grown more pronounced, as though they are being molded into copies of him." I catch M looking at T sometimes with such concentrated hatred that I fear for what might come. Hawthorne's rituals grew more bizarre. On Christmas Day, 1894, a day the rest of Springfield celebrated with carols and church services, the Hawthornes observed a different kind of ceremony. Elizabeth wrote, "Christmas passed without acknowledgement. T says Christian holidays are meaningless rituals that distract from family obligations." Instead, he held what he called a blood ceremony in the parlor, pricking each of their fingers and pressing them to a page in the black book. I was not invited to participate, but was required to witness. M asked why I was excluded, and T struck him across the face, saying, "She is vessel, not essence." I do not know what he meant, but the words chilled me. The meaning was becoming terrifyingly clear. In his twisted vision, she was merely the incubator for a legacy she could never truly be a part of. By the spring of 1895, the suffocating atmosphere in the Hawthorne house had reached a breaking point. Thaddius, his megalomania reaching its zenith, had drafted a new, more binding covenant, the very document found on the table after his death. Elizabeth's final journal entry, dated April 16, 1895, the day before the explosion of violence, is the record of a soul pushed beyond its limit. Her handwriting is erratic, a frantic scrawl across the page. He has drafted a new covenant. We are to sign it tomorrow. M says he cannot bear it any longer. I have given him the key to the gun cabinet. What will be will be. I am beyond caring now. In this single devastating entry, the entire narrative shifts. After more than 2 decades of passive suffering, Elizabeth Hawthorne made a choice. She moved from witness to accomplice, from victim to enabler of rebellion. She did not pull the trigger, but she unlocked the weapon. The quiet that had filled the house for so many years was about to be shattered by a single, definitive act of defiance. And the question of who was truly responsible would be buried with the man who had authored their torment. When Elizabeth's journals were made public in 1963, they ignited a firestorm of interest in the long-forgotten case. Thomas Jennings, a dogged reporter for the Springfield Chronicle, launched his own investigation, determined to uncover the physical evidence that would corroborate her story. He began with the house itself. Tracing property records, he discovered that the basement had been completely sealed with a layer of concrete in 1905, an unusual and expensive modification with no apparent structural purpose. Jennings managed to track down the son of the contractor, Calvin Morris, who had performed the work. Morris, then in his 80s, had a vivid memory of the job. The new owner took one look down there and said to seal the whole thing up, Morris recounted. Said he'd pay extra if we didn't discuss what we saw. There was this one room with walls a foot thick and a heavy door with a complicated lock. The floor had these dark stains that wouldn't come up, no matter how we scrubbed. It had a peculiar feel to it, that basement. A bad feel. The sanctum was real, and someone had paid a great deal of money to make sure it was never seen again. Jennings then turned his attention to the family's mysterious disappearance. He scoured records across the country, following the faint trail they had left behind. In a small rural cemetery outside Chicago, he found what he was looking for, a burial record for a Maxwell Hawthorne, dated November 1895, just 7 months after they fled Springfield. The cause of death was officially listed as respiratory failure. But the attending physician's private notes, preserved in county health archives, told a more detailed story. They mentioned evidence of long-term physical trauma and a constitution weakened by repeated stress. Maxwell had escaped the house, but he had not escaped the damage inflicted within it. His freedom was tragically brief. For Elizabeth and Josephine, the trail went cold until Jennings uncovered a passenger manifest for a steamship, the SS Campania, departing New York for Liverpool in December 1895. Among the names listed in second class were an E. Hawthorne and a J. Hawthorne. They had left America behind, hoping to outrun the ghosts of Commercial Street by crossing an ocean. The question was, had they succeeded? The mystery of Maxwell and Josephine's origins was the key to understanding Thaddius's obsession. If they weren't adopted cousins, who were they? Jennings dedicated months to this question, sending inquiries to genealogical societies and combing through archives in Pennsylvania, Hawthorne's stated place of origin. He finally found a breakthrough in the archives of the Philadelphia Inquirer. A tiny notice from January 1873 reported the death of a Margaret Blackwood, age 35, survived by 2 children who had been sent to relatives. Cross-referencing this with census records from 1870 for Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, he found her. Margaret Blackwood, age 32, occupation seamstress. Listed in her household were 2 children, Maxwell, age 9, and Josephine, age 5. No husband was listed. This would make them approximately 22 and 18 when they arrived in Springfield, the exact ages reported by observers at the time. The final, damning link was a deed of sale for a small property in Lancaster County, signed by Thaddius Hawthorne in 1873, just after Margaret's death. One of the witness signatures was for a local merchant who had also co-signed early shipping manifests to Hawthorne's store in Springfield. The connection was undeniable. They were his children, hidden away until their mother's death forced his hand. Armed with this new information and the corroborating testimony from Elizabeth's journals, Jennings successfully petitioned the county for a partial inspection of the sealed basement of the Hawthorne house, which by 1965 was operating as a restaurant. A structural engineer and a local historian carefully drilled through the concrete floor. What they found beneath was a space that matched Elizabeth's descriptions with chilling accuracy. While most of the basement was unremarkable, one section of wall had clearly been rebuilt. Behind it, they discovered the small, windowless room. The walls were lined with crumbling cork, a primitive but effective soundproofing material. The floor was made of stone slabs, unlike the packed earth of the surrounding cellar. Iron ring bolts were embedded deep in the stone floor in one wall, their purpose disturbingly obvious. And in the center of the room was a drain, carefully and deliberately plugged with concrete. No instruments or furniture remained, but the room itself was a silent testament to the horrors Elizabeth had described. The sanctum was not a product of a traumatized imagination. It was real. Due to concerns about the building's structural integrity, the basement was ordered to be resealed, once again entombing its dark secrets. While Jennings was focused on official records, another crucial piece of the puzzle emerged from a more personal source. He located Albert Peterson, the elderly son of the Hawthornes' former gardener, a man named Samuel Peterson who had worked on the property from 1885 until he was abruptly dismissed in 1891. Albert, then in his 70s, recalled his father speaking in hushed tones about the strange happenings at the Hawthorne estate. His father, Albert claimed, had once been pruning shrubs near the house when he accidentally witnessed Thaddius leading Maxwell toward the basement, not with persuasion, but at gunpoint. Samuel was fired the next day without explanation. "My father said Mr. Hawthorne was different when he thought no one was watching," Albert told Jennings. "In public, he was all proper and dignified. But on the grounds, when he thought only family could see, he moved like a predator, always watching, always controlling. Father said Mrs. Hawthorne would sometimes stand at an upstairs window for hours, just staring out like she was trying to remember what freedom looked like." Samuel Peterson had also overheard Thaddius speaking obsessively about family purity and the sacred duty to keep the Hawthorne bloodline untainted. The pieces were falling into place, pointing toward a motive far more depraved than simple physical control. The evidence was overwhelming. It was murder, preceded by years of horrific abuse. So why was it so effectively covered up? The answer lies in the intricate web of finance and influence that Thaddius Hawthorne had woven throughout Springfield. Sheriff Holbrook, who buried his own investigative notes, was facing a tough re-election campaign and knew that a scandal involving a prominent citizen would be politically disastrous. Dr. Samuel Wilson, the coroner who falsified the cause of death, owed his entire career to Hawthorne's financial backing. Most significantly, William Bryant, the owner and editor of the Springfield Monitor, the newspaper that printed the sanitized version of events, served on the board of the First National Bank alongside Hawthorne and had received substantial loans from him to expand his printing operations. These men, the law, the science, and the pre-SS, were all financially entangled with the deceased. A murder investigation would have threatened not only the town's reputation but their own livelihoods, and so a collective decision was made. The truth was too costly, too disruptive. The story of a tragic suicide was far better for business. The community's leaders chose silence, becoming the final architects of the Hawthorne family's prison. Jennings's investigation followed Elizabeth and Josephine across the Atlantic. Through extensive research in British archives, he traced a land purchase in Cornwall, England, in February 1896. The buyer was a widow named E. Hawthorne. The property was a small, isolated farm near the coast, a world away from the social pressures of Springfield. Here, Josephine finally found a semblance of a normal life. Local church records showed her marrying a farmer, William Bennett, in 1903. Years later, in 1967, inspired by Jennings's articles, a woman named Eleanor Bennett, Josephine's granddaughter, contacted the Springfield Historical Society. She confirmed that her grandmother had lived in Cornwall until her death in 1943, but the trauma of her past was a constant, silent presence. Eleanor stated that Josephine never, not once, spoke of her life in America and had made her children promise never to ask. But she left behind a single cryptic warning in a letter to her daughter, Eleanor's mother, written in 1939. It read, "Never allow any man to isolate you from the world. Walls can be built of stone, or they can be built of fear and obligation. Both are equally effective prisons." The most significant contribution from the Bennett family came decades later. In 1995, for a 100-year retrospective on the case, another journalist tracked down Eleanor's daughter, Marion Bennett. Marion shared a small, cloth-bound diary that had belonged to her great-grandmother, Josephine. Its pages, covering just 3 months in the spring of 1895, provided the final, horrifying piece of the puzzle. Josephine's entries, written with the caution of someone who feared discovery, confirmed the family's deepest dread. On March 30th, 1895, she wrote, "Father spoke today of the need for the bloodline to continue. He looked at Maxwell and me in that way again. M became ill at dinner. Father said, weakness must be purged from the line. Then, on April 10th, Father has decided the new covenant will formalize what he has been suggesting for months. M says we will die before submitting to this. I cannot live as Father intends. E watches us with pity, but does nothing." Josephine's words, combined with Thaddeus's books on eugenics, pointed to an unspeakable conclusion. The new covenant was likely intended to force an incestuous union between his own children to produce what he saw as the next, purer generation of Hawthornes. This was the future Maxwell and Josephine were facing on April 17th. Josephine's final diary entry, written on April 16th, laid bare their desperation. "Tomorrow we sign or we end this. M is resolved. I waver between terror and hope. E has made her choice at last. Whatever happens, nothing can be worse than what we have endured these 12 years." While Josephine found a new life in Cornwall, the fate of Elizabeth, the woman who made that final choice possible, remains shrouded in mystery. The Cornwall property was registered in her name until 1920, when it was transferred to Josephine, suggesting Elizabeth lived at least that long. But no death certificate or burial record for her has ever been found in England. Marion Bennett offered one tantalizing clue, a family story about a woman the children called Aunt Elizabeth, who lived with them on the farm. A photograph from around 1910 shows Josephine and her children, and in the background, a withdrawn, out-of-focus woman sits in a chair. "My mother said she rarely spoke and never left the property," Marion recalled. "The local people thought she had suffered some brain fever." Had the years of trauma so profoundly damaged Elizabeth that she retreated into a world of silence, a ghost haunting the edges of the new life she had helped create? The Hawthorne house still stands on Commercial Street, a silent brick-and-mortar witness to the events that transpired within its walls. Over the decades, it has accumulated a mythology of its own. When it operated as a restaurant in the 1960s, staff frequently quit after working late, citing a persistent, unnerving feeling of being watched. One former waitress told Thomas Jennings, "The building just felt wrong after dark, like it was holding its breath. I'd hear footsteps on the floor above, even though I knew I was alone. Or I'd catch a reflection in the window of someone standing behind me, but when I turned, there was nobody there." In the years since, as the building has housed offices and galleries, similar stories have persisted. Inexplicable cold spots, objects moving on their own, a pervasive sense of sorrow in certain rooms. These could be dismissed as simple ghost stories, the natural human impulse to project a place's dark history onto its present. Or perhaps they are something more, the lingering psychological residue of profound human suffering, an emotional imprint left on the very fabric of the building, a faint echo of the terror and despair that once filled its rooms. Among the Hawthorne archives at the Springfield Historical Society lies one final, haunting piece of evidence. It's a single sheet of paper, torn from a journal, the handwriting unmistakably Elizabeth's. It was found tucked inside another volume and was never officially catalogued. There is no date, but its content suggests it was written years later, perhaps from the quiet solitude of the Cornwall farm. It reads, "I have asked myself 1,000 times if I could have done more sooner, if I could have protected them better, broken through the walls he built around us all. But fear is a prison more secure than any stone or steel. By the time I found the courage to act, so much damage had been done. Maxwell lies in the earth now, his brief freedom purchased at terrible cost. Josephine carries scars visible only to those who know where to look. And I am neither here nor there. I exist in the space between what happened and what might have been. I have no right to peace, but I pray they find it. The Hawthorne name dies with us, as it should. May whatever darkness dwelt in his blood die with it as well." This is the final whisper from a woman who spent most of her life silenced, a confession of guilt and a prayer for absolution. The story of the Hawthorne family is a chilling reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural phantoms, but the quiet tyrants who live among us, hidden behind masks of respectability and wealth. Thaddius Hawthorne built a fortress of stone, but his true power lay in the invisible walls of fear, obligation, and psychological manipulation. His story is extreme, yet the dynamics are unnervingly familiar. The insidious nature of domestic control, the power of isolation, and the chilling silence of a community that chooses to look away. The stone wall on Commercial Street still stands, a weathered monument to a buried truth. The past is never truly gone. It sleeps beneath our feet and behind our walls, waiting for a stray discovery, a curious historian, or a descendant's courage to bring it back into the light. The sound that truly defines this case is not the shotgun blast that ended one man's life. It is the years of stifled, suffocating silence that preceded it, a silence that holds the true horror of what happened in the spring of 1895. What do you believe was the full, unspoken detail of the final covenant? Was Elizabeth's final act one of justice or simple survival? Let us know your theories in the comments below. And if you find yourself drawn to the shadowed corners of history, subscribe for more journeys into the dark.